Welcome to Overheard at Frequency, which is about engaging with the patient community on issues surrounding hearing loss and the unmet need that efforts toward hearing restoration may one day address. I'm your host, Colleen Chapman, and my goal is to bring timely and interesting stories about hearing science, advocacy, and innovation to patients. Frequency Therapeutics' mission is to develop therapeutics that will have meaningful quality of life impacts for patient community listeners. And we've made this show because we're listening to your needs and wanted to share our excitement about what we're doing to address them. There are exciting new things happening in the hearing health space beyond hearing restoration efforts and the work being done here at Frequency Therapeutics. And we'll cover some of those compelling stories too. In this episode, I sit down with Kevin Franck, former head of audiology at Mass Eye and Ear, current chair of the board for the Hearing Loss Association of America, and senior vice president for strategic marketing and new product planning with Frequency Therapeutics. We talk about three timely issues: the world of hearing health from the perspective of an audiologist, the push towards restorative therapies, and the critical role patient advocacy plays in healthcare and health policy. Welcome, Kevin. It's so great to have you here as our very first guest.
Well, thank you, Colleen. And I really appreciate being an employee of this company and having a chance to work with you and others here who are brought for this effort.
Kevin, as we start off, knowing that you're an audiologist, as I noted, when I talk with patients, many of them have very close relationships with their audiologist, and they know their audiologist as a person, and their audiologist knows them very well too. So I wanted to start by getting to know you a little bit more as a person, those who don't know you yet, and then talk about the science and the medicine that we want to get into. So you're a motorcycle guy. Let's start with the story of how you got into motorcycles. Was it a family thing for you too, or was it a different route?
Yeah, I suppose it was. My older brother had a little Suzuki FA50. It's not a moped because you couldn't pedal it, but one of those little scooters. And, I mowed lawns and I had a bunch of odd jobs, and it was a great way to get around because growing up near those Finger Lakes, there are a lot of hills. And if I didn't have the moped, I'd be taking my bicycle, which was a lot of work to get to mowing the lawns, which was also a lot of work. So it started there. And then in college, I got really good at fixing motorcycles. I had a deal that if I would fix someone's motorcycle, I wouldn't charge them, but I'd get a key and I could use it when I wanted. So I had like 4 or 5 motorcycles on campus that I could use, and they were different styles. And then I bought my first motorcycle when I lived in Seattle. And now I ride 2 different ones. One's good at roads and one's good at dirt.
Yeah. Well, that leads into, and I know you just had a great trip with the dirt bike in New England, but so that leads into my next question for you, because it's a piece of who you are. You're really a bit of a Renaissance guy. And so you got your undergraduate degree at Dartmouth in engineering.
Yep.
Then you got a PhD. Then you got your business degree from Wharton.
Yep.
Right? And then you made your way into audiology, which is, really interesting path to get there, and not necessarily the usual one. So how did all of those different pieces lead into, this incredible career in audiology?
I just found all aspects of deafness and hearing loss to be fascinating. I've always been interested in engineering. So the technology piece of that was kind of disappointing at the time. These hearing aids they didn't work very well, and they didn't do very much, but they were really important. And, I would always be fixing them and working on them, but also the language and the education and the history and the culture. I found hearing loss to be fascinating. And one degree that I got actually between Dartmouth and my PhD was a master's of science and engineering, but all about the ear. When I was applying for graduate school, I applied to one lab, Eric Young, the neural encoding lab, where all they did was study the ear. And I think that's the only school I got into because I wrote it for that lab. I said, I want to learn about the ear. And I learned more about the ear at that place than anywhere else. And there is where I kind of really got into understanding what happens at a neural level. We were recording the auditory nerves of animals to understand what happens with hearing loss and what happens with hearing aids. And that was where I first met people who had cochlear implants. So it was in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins where I really learned about the ear at a deep, deep level.
Yeah, and Johns Hopkins is still doing amazing work in the ear, and a lot of work on connecting hearing to other comorbidities, which I want to talk about in a little bit. But I do want to talk about, I mean, there's all the science of the ear, and you have a beautiful way of talking about that. But I want to start, since the podcast is patient focused and really meant to serve patients, is to get your description of what an audiologist does, because there may be some patients who are listening who haven't yet gone to an audiologist. And that's one of our challenges, is that people usually wait 5-7 years on average to go get care. So what does an audiologist do? How do they interact with the patient? What's their role?
So a clinical audiologist is someone who's licensed and, by a state to see patients and do different things. And that license gives them kind of the purview to do both diagnostics and rehabilitation for hearing and balance issues. And let's focus in on hearing. And so diagnostic means running a series of tests to understand, where the hearing loss is and what might be able to do, what one might be able to do with it. And that might mean working with a surgeon. But the other piece is helping people with their hearing loss. And that has a variety of different pieces to it. One is helping them learn to understand how their hearing works and how to interact with the environment to make the hearing system best ready to deal with noise and context and multiple speakers. Then there's technology, and there's a variety of technology that can change the environment or change sound to be more beneficial for people with hearing loss. And working with someone to learn how to use these technologies. And second is to connect them to become their own advocates, self-advocates, by introducing them to other people who have hearing loss and who have shared experiences. I only have a little bit of hearing loss that would be, typical for my age, but I haven't had to walk the same walk that many people with hearing loss have. And so when I connect those people to those others, they really have that empathy to coach and guide people through their journey.
Yeah, and so you went from, all of the path that we just described, and you studied in a very scientific environment about the science of the ear, and then you became a care provider working directly with patients. So what was that very first week of being an audiologist? What was the most memorable moment of that first week?
Yeah, I do remember one patient. I was a graduate student, so I was learning to be a clinician under the, working with licensed clinicians. And I remember a couple, they weren't, an older, but not too old couple. And she had just had her cochlear implant turned on. And she described how she and her husband had fallen in love having these conversations. And she had lost her hearing and stopped having these conversations. And they were kind of cohabitating for a decade or two. And she got her cochlear implant and said she was falling in love with her husband again. And her husband was just sitting there smiling. And just to be able to witness for them, for that couple for whom spoken communication was the path to their relationship, their love, to see that come back and to just be witness to that was humbling. And to understand the role the audiologist has to perhaps introduce them to that technology and get it working was really impactful. And I remember that conversation. I can almost picture it. I can picture the room. I can picture how they look. And I just remember her telling that story. And for me, as a graduate student about to embark on that career was really exciting.
I mean, first of all, it must have been so fulfilling to have that, immediate impact on someone's life. But there are other things that patients bring up when I'm talking with them about quality of life, which you mentioned, which is the interaction with other people. And a lot of the patients, what they raise is that people who don't have hearing loss tend to not understand how isolating it can sometimes be for people with hearing loss, even, moderate hearing loss that impacts them in certain ways at work and in their relationships. Can you share a little bit for people who don't yet know the full world of hearing loss, the quality of life issues that go along with it for patients?
Yeah, I'll do my best. As people with hearing loss have taught me, all of us struggle to converse in some environments. Even if you have normal hearing, it's hard when it's very noisy. But the more hearing loss you have, the more environments are difficult to have communication. So when you start having appreciable hearing losses, you're having a difficult communicating, even in quiet places, or hearing your grandchildren, or even getting by at a table at work where you're discussing various things. So the number of environments that become difficult increase. And sometimes the stakes of those environments increase too. If you miss that conversation that says where you're going to meet up with your grandchild or what time the game is, that would be awful to miss that. Or same thing if at work, you're asked a question, but you answer an entirely different question. That could be really embarrassing. And these things lead to people kind of withdrawing sometimes, or other times just really wanting to be in control of the conversation so they can be understood but not understand. And these can have real impacts on relationships. At the end of the day, communication is about building relationships with people we love or people we work with. And when hearing loss gets in the way of that, if you use spoken and listening communication, it can rob you of that ability to stay close to people. And that's why I think people with hearing loss are so engaged in helping others when they've found solutions to ensure that those solutions get widespread.
Yeah, and so you've mentioned that a few times, that advocacy of advocating for yourself and advocating for others. And there are patient groups in different places, Rochester, New York, for example, that are developing tools for people at work to help sit in certain places and learn certain techniques they can do to make it better for them in a work environment, and also help their colleagues understand how to make it better as well. But then there's the component of advocating for yourself, for your own care with physicians and others. Can you talk about why that's so important, maybe for patients who aren't yet advocating for themselves to do that, why they have to do that, and how to do it effectively?
Hearing loss is one of these issues that is so rarely addressed, and people wait a long time before they do anything about hearing loss. And part of that time is even understanding they have it. Hearing loss is often gradual, not always, but often gradual. And so sometimes the first person to notice is a life partner, a spouse or a child or a close friend that says, do you have trouble hearing? And the person might say, oh, no. But, and so it takes a while for someone to be aware. And that's why we really want primary care physicians to include hearing loss as part of their routine assessment of really helping to be, someone who understands the impact of hearing on all aspects of health. And if they can be more involved, and I know they're really busy, and there's a lot of different aspects of health that they're asked to screen for. But that's one area. If we can kind of raise the awareness of all caregivers to make hearing loss a part of the conversation, to say that, oh, maybe I do have hearing loss, well, then what? Well, then you need to be referred to an audiologist to have it tested to see how much it is and what there can be done about it. Because if we can intervene earlier, we can really reduce the chance of those communication breakdowns environments that are important. So awareness of self and then awareness of others to get people the help that they need.
Yeah, and we could do an entire hour on the science of the ear and hearing, but can you give people a snapshot of the science of the ear and its connection to the brain?
Sure. So when I was at Johns Hopkins, I remember being taught the lesson that the ear, of course, I was studying the ear, and these people were ear specialists, and they were describing the ear being charged and being run by the most powerful battery in the body. And as a young biomedical engineer, like, that's fascinating. Tell me more. And what happens in the cochlea, that tiny little organ the size of the fingernail on your pinky, has the most impressive organ in the human body, of course. And there's a series of cells whose job it is to pump potassium ions into the scala media. And on the other side of the scala media is the surface of the hair cell. And so it sets up this electric potential gradient of about 120 millivolts, which is huge. And that battery powers the auditory system, because the auditory system is not just a passive organ waiting to listen. It's an active organ that contributes to the sounds that are perceived to make them sharper and clearer and more precise. And to understand how that organ works is really just dizzying in the beauty and the complexity of human design. And it's just fascinating to learn about that. Now, people who love other organs think their organs are just as cool too, but I'm not convinced.
So not only are we just incredibly fortunate to have you at Frequency, and you've been on the kind of the vanguard of hearing health in different places. You've worked on the device side, and you worked at Mass Eye and Ear, in incredibly profound direct care. But you also are the chair of the largest advocacy organization in the United States for patients with hearing loss, the Hearing Loss Association of America, which is an incredible organization. And the Hearing Loss Association of America just led the first national meeting with the FDA about what patients are going through on a daily basis, what their daily lives look like with hearing loss, and also what patients really want to see in terms of the future of care. And there were various options that they had in terms of responding to what they wanted to see. And overwhelmingly, the patients said the thing that they are most excited about and most want in the future for their care is regenerative medicine. So can you talk about why that is, why that's what they most want, and from your perspective, how they feel it could make their quality of life better?
So it's fascinating that people wanted their organ regenerated more than they wanted improved hearing. And I think what that means, and it's up to anyone's interpretation, this was a vote, was that the difference with the promise of regenerative medicine is to repair the organ of hearing itself. Improved hearing can be had through many different means. I can improve my hearing by just asking people around me to be quiet, or to use another microphone, or to use some communication strategy. And those are great because they help you hear, but the problem with it is it may include having other people do things or having to use technology. And I think what people were asking for is, I just want my ear to work better. I want to hear like I did before I lost my hearing. And so that's what I found quite profound about that statement, that people were looking for the improvement of the organ as the top priority, even over ways of improving their hearing, because I think everyone in the audience knew there are ways to improve their hearing, but some of them are difficult to pull off.
Yeah, of course, it was exciting for us at Frequency to hear that is what patients wanted most, because that's what we work on. But for patients who don't yet know what we're really focused on trying to achieve at Frequency, first through FX322, can you walk patients through the science behind what we're focused on, why we're focused on what we are, and what we hope it might possibly be able to do?
Absolutely. And I'll bring it back to graduate school. When I was at University of Washington, Ed Rubel was one of the professors, and he was working on hair cell regeneration, and he was teaching his classes, and I was one of his students, and said that this is coming, this is 5 years away. And I was in graduate school in the late 90s. And we were working really hard on all kinds of technologies, and he was saying, yeah, that's great, but one day we're going to be able to repair the cochlea. And throughout my career, it was always over the horizon. And I kept, as we all did in the field, we all kept abreast of it, listening at conferences and reading, and people like Ed Rubel continued to speak a lot about it. And because other creatures, hair cells regenerate all the time. And parts of our own bodies regenerate all the time. Why is it that mammals, didn't do what reptiles and birds did? And the thought was, if we could figure that out, we might be able to have our hair cells regenerate like other creatures do and like other organs do. And something changed, maybe 5-10 years ago, where the fundings, in addition to the NIH funding research to do this in academic labs, you started to see private investment in companies. And this was around the time when I was in Boston. And so, when I saw the early data from Frequency and I saw the amount of investment, it was like, wait a second, this isn't over the horizon anymore. These are ships that are beginning to come to port. And that's just incredibly exciting. And so the prospect of, the idea, the design of drugs that could convince cells that are already in the cochlea, that when they were in utero, gave birth to hair cells, specialized hair cells, but since being born kind of sat there just being supporting cells, the thought that you could convince them to go back in their history and act like they were young again and have a hair cell and have that hair cell work was just mind-blowing. And it was that story that convinced me to leave clinic and academia. In my career, I haven't just been in clinic and academia. I've moved through corporate medical device, consumer device, startups, even other types of prosthesis. Like I worked on a bionic leg. So I've always been really attracted to the forefront of science and of new things and risk. And to me, this is a moonshot. The opportunity to try to do something that's never been done before in a mammal to help people hear better. I had to do it, and I was lucky that Frequency hired me to do the job.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And like I said, Renaissance guy, bionic leg work as well. But I mean, that's exactly why, why I came to and brought my patient work to Frequency, because I just think it's the possibility to break through. And of course, we're still in clinical phase, but the possibility is just so exciting. And as you already described, what it would mean for the quality of life and the independence of millions of people is really exciting too. Now that you've walked through a little bit of the restorative treatment world, there is, as I mentioned, the Advocates had a huge success a couple years ago, very recently.
Yeah.
Big breakthrough on over-the-counter hearing aids and in creating a world in which patients can go into a pharmacy or Target or a Walmart and buy a hearing aid for themselves with no need to see a physician or get the tests beforehand. But what's your view of what this over-the-counter access that is coming will mean for the world of hearing?
Policy and technology need to evolve together. And I think there was a time where all hearing devices needed to be fit according to methods that use tools and procedures that audiologists used in the clinic. And then things changed, right? Then we had, handheld computers with wireless chips and well-designed interfaces and improved technology. And those technologies proved that they could play a role in giving users direct access to some of those settings and some of those changes. And when we appreciate the fact that what changed was the technology, and when we follow the science to say, what can that technology enable? It opens up an opportunity for people who wouldn't otherwise go get the type of clinical care from an audiologist. And with the advent of that technology and the evidence of the data, we and others were able to go to legislators and help advocate for them to write a law that would compel the FDA to create a class of devices that are designed for self-fitting. Now, they're not for everybody. They're for people who perceive themselves to have mild to moderate hearing loss. And I'm only reflecting what's in the law that will eventually become the FDA's definition of a device. And these are people now who may not go get their hearing checked. They may be in that 7 years before it gets bad enough for them to be convinced to go get professional help. And if they can use their Apple AirPods or their whatever device that has hearing technology imbued in them, then they may begin to get hearing benefit far earlier than they would otherwise. And I think we just need to make sure those are good devices and we have good reviews of them by people who use them, and perhaps a consumer reports type way for people to learn. And I think organizations like HLAA and people like audiologists will do a good job of saying, these are the good ones, and these are the ones that aren't as good, just like there are good cars and cars that aren't so good, to really guide people with hearing loss to those right choices. So it's very exciting. I do think that with these over-the-counter devices, more people will have access to hearing care because they're available to them in more places, and they may be available at lower costs. But I absolutely believe that the value of an audiologist is far beyond just a device, and that audiologists play a central role in how people are going to continue to hear well throughout their hearing journey.
It's so exciting to see the power of the patients getting stronger and stronger as a community. What is it that makes this community so special?
Empathy. And I think, to me, empathy is the ability to envision someone else's life. And, as I mentioned before, my empathy is only gained through talking with a lot of people with hearing loss, but people with hearing loss have an even deeper dimension of that because it's their own journey. And when people get together with true empathy, they not only can give advice and all that, but they can also appreciate what it's like for that person in their unique circumstance. And empathy, for something as big as hearing loss is so attractive, but the empathy they get from a local chapter of an HLAA group or other organizations that bring them that same voice empowers them to stand up and say, no, I have a right to good communication. I have a responsibility to take care of my ears and do what I can to help them hear better, but so does the person speaking. And if that person is a business or a hospital, they need to speak to me properly and they need to control their noise. And that empowerment that comes from empathy is the most powerful thing on earth, because it moves each of us to do something greater than ourselves. And to me, yeah, there's technology and there's one day will be regenerative medicine, but at the end of the day, it's up to people to use these things and to understand what they can and can't do. And that's going to come from people really communicating with each other, empowering each other, and understanding what it's like to walk in their shoes.
Yeah, and I think, one of the really exciting things at this moment in time is it's not only the existence of the community and the strength of that community, but the growing influence and voice of the patient community in the hearing health space to say what they want and then educate others on what they're, bringing the empathy perspective to others to create the things that they want to see happen. And I can't wait to see what happens with that over the coming years. I think the patient advocacy space, and we're going to hear in a future podcast from some of the leaders in that space, is really, really exciting. So, well, thanks, Kevin. Thanks so much for being our inaugural guest. And it's just been really nice, as always, to have the time together.
It's great to chat with you, and it's great to do this work together.
Agreed. Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Overheard at Frequency. Many thanks again to Kevin Franck for joining us and to the externally led patient-focused drug development event hosted by the Hearing Loss Association of America for allowing us to share the polling conducted during the patient-focused event. Please be sure to subscribe to Overheard at Frequency to hear more conversations like this one. Overheard at Frequency was created by Suzanne Day, Colleen Chapman, Jason Glashow, Michael Schubert, Dina Krug, and Zach Russo, with production, editorial, and design assistance from Victor Burbison and Meg Yoshida. Until next time, take care, and thank you for listening.